Hello, my name is Karen Shackleton, and I'm the founder and chair of Pensions for Purpose, which is a collaborative platform looking to help pension funds make informed decisions about ESG, sustainable and impact investing. And today, this is the first in a series of conversations with senior industry figures who are championing the sustainability cause for our world today. It's my great pleasure to be speaking today to Sir John Rose. John is a non-executive director of Hambo Perks, chairman of the Ombu Group, and chair of the advisory board for the Hambo Perks Environmental Technology Fund. He is also deputy chairman of Rothschild Continuation Holdings and senior advisor to Rothschild & Co. And he's an advisory board member of a green hydrogen firm, Protean. He sits on the investment committee of the British Design Fund and recently joined the advisory board of COP28. I'm delighted to be talking to you today, John, about your insights on climate change, COP28 and investment solutions that address the climate challenge. So welcome.
Morning.
So, John, when we last met, you described yourself as a pragmatist, and I'd like to begin by just exploring that a little bit. I mean, given that you're obviously involved in a very large number of different businesses, including some which have got a focus on purpose, such as the Hambo Perks Environmental Technology Fund, I'm interested to know, have you always been interested in environmental and societal issues? And how has your thinking on it evolved over the years? And what does being a pragmatist imply for you?
That could be quite a long answer. I think I've always been interested, though it wasn't at the core of what I did. Obviously, when I used to run Rolls-Royce, which was clearly, at least partially, involved in emitting CO2, but in a technically very competent way. But there was also a big component of what we did at Rolls, which was looking at use of fuels, use of alternative fuels. We also had a nuclear business, worked on hydrogen, fuel cells, and so on. So there was always a component of what I did that was related to the agenda. But I suppose the history is I grew up in Africa. My father was a scientist. One of his specialities was erosion. So, it was always part of the conversation. The impact of climate and behavior on our environment, and bad farming practices and so on. So yes, it's always been part of what I think about. Post retiring from my main job, it's become easier to build my own focus on those sorts of issues. And on the whole, what I get involved in is purpose-led in the broadest sense. And to the point about pragmatism, I'm a bit like, Ernest Moniz put it very well. He's the was the Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration, which is the old anecdote about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. We actually have to do things, and we have to, and we mustn't not do things because they aren't going to provide the whole solution. There is no silver bullet to the sorts of issues that we're facing today, which are not only about climate, but also about the way we live in the world. And it's going to take a myriad of little steps to make a big difference. And in many ways, I think the little steps are more capable of engaging the community because they're visible and mean something. It's very easy for individuals to feel that they're powerless, in the face of, what's described as a climate emergency, because it's going to require, collaboration between all the governments in the world, and the biggest institutions in the world, and the individual doesn't feel that they can make a difference. And they, in a sense, they say, well, look, we'll wait and see what they come up with. And, on the day that China agrees with India, then, we might get engaged. Whereas the little things which make a difference that are visible can engage people and help people, get people mobilized and be measurable in a very meaningful way. Whereas, a reduction of 0.0% in 1% in CO2 is hard to envisage. Whereas, measurable cleaner air or cleaner water or, better availability of water or using less water are very, very measurable goals, which, can be simple to understand.
And this is where I think, pension fund investment is hugely powerful because of the volume of capital that is potentially available to apply to some of these technologies. Thinking about your role as an advisory board member at COP, have you got any personal hopes or any aspirations for COP28?
Yes, I've got a lot of hopes, and actually it's been interesting how the narrative around COP28 has begun to change. Part of the reason I got involved in the first place is that I thought it was actually a very good thing that it was being hosted by an oil producing nation. Many years ago, I was on the Eden Project board, and its founder, Tim Smith, who is an interesting speaker on this subject, did a speech at a WaterAid conference, and he basically got up and he asked the assembled audience, how many of you think that water is one of the existential issues? And everyone put their hands up. Obviously, they were at a WaterAid conference. He then said, how many of you think you can do anything about it? And very few put their hands up. And he said, yes. And the problem is the people who can do something about it are the people you love to hate, the people you love to demonize, the big institutions who have capital, people, capability, the technologies, the project management skills, etc., to execute the projects that we need to have completed in order to deal with this issue. And I think, and that sort of informs my view around COP, which is it's really important that the oil producing nations are complicit. It's really helpful having a focus on what they're doing. And, it's back to the pragmatism point. It is, I think, unhelpful simply to be cynical about what they might do by assuming that it is simply about extending the period over which they can produce oil. Because that sort of doesn't matter. What's important is they do something. And they have the money and they have the skills. They are chemical engineers and mechanical engineers and project managers and so on. And so they have the capacity, but they also have the need. In the case of Abu Dhabi and the UAE, they live in an environment where already in the summer, it's pretty unworkable. And they've recognized the need for change for a long time. They created Masdar, which is their renewable energy sort of city and business 15 odd years ago. They've the only people to have completed a nuclear power station in the last decade. They've weaned themselves off dependency on oil. So it's now 35% of their economy rather than 90. And they are the biggest investors in renewables. So they recognize the need from their own purposes. They've got real issues around climate in terms of livability, food security, water, and so on. So they firsthand understand these things. And so I think it's really important to have them as a host and be part of making the industry, both the big independent oil companies and the national oil companies, complicit in the solutions. And it's not going to be easy, but they have significant convening power in that sector. So I think it's what I would hope to come out of it is perhaps a greater focus on the enablers of responding to the pressures that the change in the climate is putting on us, but also, population growth and urbanization and so on, which are, putting a huge pressure on resources. And I think that they are, they're a technocratic nation. And I think it will be a positive if we can come out of this with some better answers around, getting technologies we already have deployed faster, dealing with the skills deficit. We have a huge skills deficit. If we're all trying to execute against the same plan, we don't have the people. So some answers, it seems to me, around that, recognizing what the financial constraints are and what needs to be resolved, understanding what the resource constraints are and what needs to be resolved, understanding what the skills issues are, and understanding where we can prioritize the application of existing technologies to have a big impact. So, for instance, there are oil fields in the world which don't mitigate methane, but the technology exists to do it. So, can we do a mapping of where the methane is and where the application of already existing technology can make a huge difference, in Turkmenistan, for instance. So for me, it's all about being realistic about, the cost and capability of dealing with, mitigation and adaptation, and, some priorities around action that's going to make a visible difference relatively quickly. If you sort out methane in Turkmenistan, you've dealt with the biggest emitter of methane today, and we know we can do it.
It's really interesting. And I mean, some of the points that you're making about the oil companies as well, we find in our conversations with pension funds that they tend to fall into two camps: those that want to green their portfolio and those who want to green the world. And depending on what they feel that is their responsibility, and you can argue it both ways, it does lead them to a slightly different course of action regarding the fossil fuel companies, for example. But I mean, a common message that we give is that you have to look beneath the headline numbers on climate emissions and see what's the company actually doing to adapt and to move towards a net zero position. But thinking about the COP28 gathering, I had a look at the website and it says this: we are at a halfway point. It's been 7 years since Paris, 7 years to go to 2030. We must respond to the facts. We need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 and course correct on adaptation, finance and loss and damage. I mean, this is just an awesome task ahead of us. I mean, what do you think are going to be the key obstacles to achieving or accelerating towards net zero from this point, from where we are today?
Well, I think, can I firstly just make a comment on your last point about people's investment? I think in making these investment decisions about, greening your portfolio and so on, or not investing in fossil fuel producers or miners or whoever it is that falls into your bucket, careful what you wish for, because do we want these producers to be owned by private, poorly regulated operators who are simply running them for cash, which we know can be done. If you're able to buy resources at a discount and you have a view about the ability of the world to wean itself off them, you potentially have a very attractive cash investment. But you may not be terribly concerned about everything from health and safety to mitigation. So I think there's a lot to be said for having these assets owned and run by people who have a sense of responsibility. So that's the point there. So I think people need to think about that when they're investing. Careful what you wish for. Do you want your coal mine owned by some, pirate operator, or do you want it owned by someone who's responsible and is going to minimize the impact of the use of that resource? On the target, I think part of it is a plea for realism. They are being, if you look at the website and you look at the comments that Dr. Sultan has been making, who's the next president of COP, it's all about realism, really. And one of the things we've got to do is be very realistic about, as I've said earlier, the costs and capability associated with responding. And also be much more realistic than I think we tend to be about whole life cycle. So we've got to be, thoughtful about why we're doing what we're doing. A good example is electric vehicles. That, in terms of CO2, is probably not the best answer in the world. In terms of local air quality, it's not bad. But, particularly with the heavier electric vehicles and the propensity of the world to buy SUVs, their particulates from wheels and brakes are huge because these are big, heavy things powered by very heavy batteries. And logically, if we were, serious about electric vehicles, we'd be looking for the lightest, simplest vehicle to minimize, the battery size and the consequences of driving them. So I think that's a sort of mini example, but I think the sort of at the macro level, being really realistic about the cost and the implications of what we're trying to achieve, i.e. a sort of realistic context setting so that we're making good decisions and setting good priorities is really important. And I think, there's clearly a big role for the advocacy. I put that sort of in the bucket, which is everything from Extinction Rebellion to, Greenpeace. There's a big role for that. I think it's a really important to have the burr under the saddle. But we've got to make our responses capable of being achieved. So in the case of the developing countries, for instance, a big part of the issue is cost of capital. If we can get cost of capital right, that's going to be a big component of the COP conversation. We can have a huge impact on future CO2. In theory, the developing countries should be capable, many of them, of essentially having a renewables-based electricity system. But there's a cost to that. If we're successful in doing it, the avoided CO2 is huge. I mean, in Africa, they probably use 10% of the energy we do per head. So if you can make the next 90% renewable, makes a big difference. But if you can't do that, if renewables can't do more than simply deal with the growth in energy needs globally, then we're going to find it really hard to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, which still provide 80% or so of our energy needs. So I think part of the agenda at UAE is the UAE is going to be setting a really realistic context. What are the barriers? Cost of capital, resources, technical skills, and so on. And how do we deal with each of those? And I'm not sure that it's well understood.
And certainly, as a pragmatist, I think you're very well placed to feed into that discussion. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fascinating. You've talked a little bit in some of your comments about solutions being an essential part of reaching our goal of being a sustainable world over the long term. And I wonder if you could just perhaps touch on some of the funds that you're involved in, for example, the Harrow Perks Environmental Tech Fund 2, and then also I think there's another fund that you're involved with as well, talking about solutions. So you just talk about those funds a little bit and how they are working towards the COP28 goal.
Well, I think one of the things that is important to realize is that most of these solutions are industrial. They're not what we would describe as tech, and therefore we've got to understand the sort of development life cycle of businesses that are providing engineered solutions, that have to be proven to be scalable, manufacturable, supportable, and so on, and to be as good as whatever they're replacing. So you're trying to persuade people to take on new technologies that are better, for the environment, so they use less energy or they lose less water or whatever. But all those benefits can be lost if the thing doesn't work properly. So if you're if you have an industrial process that is now powered by hydrogen, which is, say, a good thing, but it doesn't work as well as whatever its predecessor technology was, the lost output very quickly outweighs financially the benefits that you might give through the technology. So these things take a long time to develop, and there are big barriers to adoption. Now, part of what we're going to need is some regulatory pressure to make adoption easier. But also we need, patient money, because these are industrial developments. They take years. It's not like a tech investment where you probably know whether it's going to be a success or not in a few years, particularly if it's business to consumer. It's much more, of a 10 to 15 year cycle, from inception to market adoption and revenue. So I think there's a sort of state of mind that we need to get into, which is that these things aren't simple. These are technical solutions. They're going to involve engineering, chemical engineering, and materials and so on. And essentially, businesses who we need to adopt them at scale are conservative and are concerned about their own bottom line. So an example of a business that's in our existing portfolio is a company called Isotope, which does waterless cooling of data centers. Now, data centers, now I think the statistic is the data centers globally use the same amount of energy as the UK. It's fastest growing emitter in the world. So it's exceeding aviation. It's growing very fast. It not only emits a lot of CO2 because it's typically not powered by renewable energy, but it also uses a lot of water for cooling. So you've got pressure on communities who have also a need for that water. And water's a different topic, but it's one of our worst managed resources. We misprice it very badly. Isotope basically has a waterless cooling technology. It came out of Leeds University, but it's been going now for over a decade. It's clearly a very good technology. The consultancies who operate in that area love it. It's been trialed, but it takes a long time, because if you've got a data center and something doesn't work, that's a pretty bad thing. And so the fact that you use no water and you have 40% less energy has to be set against the risk of adaptation or adoption rather. And these things are challenging. I think it will get adopted. It's a pretty good technology, and it's now being used in trials, paid trials, by most of the majors. So I think it will get adopted, and it'll be, an interesting solution. It reduces CO2, and it reduces and it eliminates pretty much water use. And interestingly, in the last funding round, the lead funder was Temasek in Singapore, because for them, they just put a moratorium on building data centers because they're water short, energy short, and space short. And this deals with all of those issues, because you can build upwards. Once you don't have to have a huge hall for all your servers and so on, and your racks, you can build upwards. So, they don't use, it doesn't use water, it uses less energy, and it uses less space. So they were the key funder of the last round. So I suppose the point is, there are no miracle cures. They take a long time. You have to believe that they're going to be capable of being used in an industrial situation, i.e. very reliable, and supportable. And you're going to have to go through a big process of testing and so on before it gets adopted. So it's going to take time, and there aren't quite a lot of money has been raised in this sector, and I suspect we've over raised, because I think there are fewer companies we think that really have the capability to go through all those hoops. So I think there'll be a lot of, it's a story-rich environment. It's very easy to make a story around this sort of investing, because it's doing good and it's going to affect the lives of people and so on. So it's quite easy to persuade people to make an impulse investment. We've got to be really realistic about where the technology is and where it can lead. And ultimately, these have to be profitable businesses. This isn't philanthropic. They have to be profitable businesses, because otherwise they're not going to attract the continuing investment they need.
I mean, I think pension funds are incredibly well placed to consider opportunities like this, because they do have patient capital. It's very aligned to their liabilities, which are very long term, of course.
Yeah.
And they don't, it's certainly the open schemes don't have an issue with illiquidity. It's not a priority for them. So, but one of the things that I'm always stressing to pension funds is the importance of doing impact due diligence and making sure that you understand how the impact will be achieved, and really sort of lifting up the bonnet and looking inside, because apart from potential for reputation risk if things go wrong, you do fundamentally have fiduciary responsibilities to deliver reasonable market rate returns. So it's to make sure that you're convinced. But I hear a lot of exciting opportunities. As you say, there are great stories out there. I want to come back to COP27, looking back at the last COP. And the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary said the heart of implementation is for everybody, everywhere in the world, every single day, doing everything they possibly can to address the climate crisis. Now, you talked about this sort of feeling of fatigue and sort of, well, my changes aren't going to change the world. I mean, how can we get over that? I mean, what can we do to make people feel like everything we do does make a difference?
I think you have to bring it, I think it's very clear you have to bring it down to a local level. So you have to make these goals that can be achieved and visible locally. It's as simple as, not having islands of wet wipes in the Thames. We've got effectively up by Hammersmith Bridge, an island of wet wipes the size of 2 tennis courts. Those are visible to people, and if they're not there, you feel a lot better. So I think it's about being very focused on things that people can see, or where the results can be, in a very simple way, made available to people. So, air quality is measurably better as a consequence of X, or, the potability of water is much better, or, the amount of plastic around. And I think we are going to have to realize that simple sort of market drivers aren't enough, that there are going to have to be regulatory interventions. An example, a number of the big plastics users have made promises about the amount of recycled plastic they'll use in their packaging. And they made those promises 7, 8 years ago. There isn't the capacity in the world to meet their commitments. They hoped that by saying this is what we're going to do, that the market would come along and provide it. And it can't. These things are complicated. They need a huge investment. Dealing with plastic recycling is a chemical engineering task. It is very, very, very difficult. And it needs a lot of money. And if those plastics users and producers, so everybody from INEOS to Unilever, want plastic to be dealt with, they need to invest in it. Simply desiring it isn't going to get there. There is just a huge deficit. And I think that sort of example applies everywhere. Simply saying it isn't going to magic up a bunch of entrepreneurs and a bunch of investment. You're going to have to regulate it, and you're going to have to support it. And people like British Infrastructure Bank and Business Bank and so on are going to have to pump prime and help. And we're going to have to get much better at creating the pathway for building these businesses. Oddly, in this country, it's easier to get early stage financing than it is to get growth financing. So, if the pension funds can focus on that phase, that'll make a big difference. And they'll need to collaborate, because the environment is a catch-all, but it's like everything, it's incredibly granular. There are every sector and subsector needs a whole pool of knowledge. Whether it's the use of mycelium in fake leather, or onshore fish farming. All of these things, the devil's in the detail. So, you need to be clear that you really understand the businesses that you're investing in. So probably the best ways to do it for the pension funds will be to do it through specialist investors, people who do agri-tech, or people who do water or food or whatever. So that they have the insights that people who are in that environment every day, because there's not a lot of that. It's not like a public company. There aren't gazillions of analysts and so on. So you have to seek out the best people. And in the case of the funds that I'm involved in, we make sure we have a scientist as one of the investors. Because the early due diligence on, does this actually have the capacity to work, is quite important. And you can save yourself a lot of time if you understand the chemistry or the physics. So I think there's a real role for the pension funds to play in terms of growth capital. How they deploy it is going to be interesting, because it's these are relatively small investments typically. So for them, it's an expensive sector to cover, so they probably need to find a way of of getting the best in class to help them deploy.
It'll be interesting to see the feedback that comes out of the government consultation as well, of pension funds allocating 10% to private equity to boost growth. I mean, I think that's kind of trying to address some of the concerns that you've expressed.
But growth is more venture capital. Private equity will typically be, the larger businesses who, have revenue and profitability. The challenge around venture is what you're trying to do is to, help the initial entrepreneurs with, market access to funding, strategic advice, and so on. And what you're trying to do is give them access to a network that is much bigger than they could have achieved by themselves, plus access to capital. And but it's quite hands-on. So more hands-on than private equity. It's and you've got to, if you're going to do it, you have to understand that it's quite executive.
I just feel that if you open up the blockages further down the chain, then it sort of releases opportunities for those further back. So
absolutely.
I'm hoping it will facilitate more investment into some of these opportunities.
Yes, I think private equity is important, but I think that where there's a real lack in the UK is the sort of venture growth.
Yeah.
So if you talk to Ed Bentel at Cambridge Innovation Capital, he's really focused on the pathway for the businesses that they've identified in Cambridge and grown to a certain size and now need a different sort of capital, a different sort of environment to grow. And he's very thoughtful about it. He's a good guy.
Point well made. Thank you. I want to come on to the fact that every time I look at the news, there's another dramatic climate risk being talked about. We've got fires in Greece, Hawaii, unprecedented storms in California. We've got extreme heat in Southern Europe. I mean, it's just everywhere. Every time you look at the press, there's something going on. And I kind of been asking myself the question, are our leaders sufficiently transformational? Are they doing enough? I mean, you talked about the need for regulation, changing legislations. What else would you like them to be doing?
I think it comes back partly to one of the earlier points we made, which is we do have a sort of crisis mentality around a lot of these things, and we have a sort of seem to have a resistance to going deep into causality. And it may be climate that is to do with is causing the greater propensity for fires, but it's also human action. It is, do we manage our electricity grids properly? A lot of the fires in the West Coast are started when you get interference between trees and electricity power lines. So we need to monitor this better. We need to have drones flying down the electricity lines, making sure that when they see a branch close to an electricity line, they cut it. I mean, so that isn't climate change that's causing that. That is our behavior. It's the lack of investment in preventative measures. The way we treat forests, the way we coppice and so on, makes a difference to flammability. A certain amount of forest fire is good. It would have happened naturally anyway. But inevitably, we've put buildings in places where there weren't buildings before, and these disasters didn't affect people. So they weren't as prominent. And it was clear that this one in Maui, it was at least partially there was a contribution that was made by the lack of responsiveness of the electricity provider. In terms of turning off, the grid. So I think climate is clearly part of it. I try and avoid the arguments about what's anthropogenic and what is, just happening, because we've had climate cycles in the past. So I try and avoid that argument, because I think you can spend all day arguing about it and you're not making progress. But we know we're going to have to adapt to climate change. So focusing on adaptation is really important. The other forcing factor is, population growth, wealth, and urbanization, which is putting huge pressure on resources. And I think water is a huge issue. And the third issue is around, as it were, security, which has been really thrown into prominence by the combination of the pandemic and Ukraine. So, there are issues around, energy security, water security, food security, which can be addressed. And I think if you focus on those sorts of issues, you can make a big difference by simply addressing addressable problems. They can be defined. You can get your mind around them. You can focus on, Israel went from being water short to being an exporter of water by focusing on it, because for them it was an existential issue. So you can do these things, and I think it's about, as I said, I think it's about getting the context right so that we get our priorities right. And then a combination of money and regulation is going to be needed, because the markets aren't going to be the only answer. On the bigger issue of, global emissions, things like COP are important because they are about trying to get consensus. But, sadly, I think global consensus is, extremely difficult. Therefore, focusing on things which have a local impact and mean something to the governments or the people or both is going to be important. We can't solve for the fact that China has probably permitted 90 coal-fired power stations this year. We can't solve for that. So we've got to decide what we're trying to solve for.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time. We'll probably be able to bring this to a close now. So I've got a couple of questions for you to finish with. First is, have you got a call to action for pension funds? Now, you talked about venture capital, so maybe that's it. But if there's anything else you'd like to make a call to action for pension funds? And then second is a personal question for you. Do you actually believe in legacy? Is it important to you? And if yes, or either way, what would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I think the answer on legacy is quite simple. No, it's not important to me. What's important to me is sort of having fun and doing things that interest me, that make a difference. And so I'm not terribly worried about legacy, but what I'd like to do is work on good things with nice people, and that keep me interested. I think the environment matters. So, I'm interested in it. And on the whole, you can get really engaged with, what individual companies and society is trying to do. So, it's great fun being involved in the hydrogen business, because, they're trying to solve some of the problems around the adoption of hydrogen, but in a novel way. They're looking at distributed hydrogen as opposed to distributing hydrogen. So what they're looking is local hydrogen generation using renewables, driven initially by an industrial application, but then available for community. And that, I think, is a really good model, and it could be adopted in a lot of places. It could be adopted in Africa and so on. Africa has a huge capacity for renewables. and hydrogen just needs water and energy, basically, an electrolyzer. And it's a very, so I find the whole sort of the problem solving part of environmental investing really interesting. And as I said, going back to the our original point about it's easy to write good stories. Vertical farming as an example. It's a lovely story. You can do it with renewable energy. It's on a small footprint. It can be close to the point of use, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we haven't yet worked out ways of growing anything with huge value. Yet. But there was a huge amount of excitement around it. And, the biggest one in America has just got into real problems. Just because you can't, when money was easy, people would, keep funding the deficits. But when money isn't as easy and it's more expensive, which it is now, it's harder to do that. People's, patient capital becomes more impatient. So I suppose I find, that personally, I think there are a lot of problems that need to be solved. They're going to require, deep understanding of science and manufacturing and execution and project management and so on. So I just think it's a very interesting sector. My criteria are very simple. I think it needs to make a difference, and it needs to be measurable, and it needs to be profitable. And so from the point of view of the pension funds, I think it's a tremendous initiative to put more of their capital to work in the early stage, rather than, in bonds and the public markets. So I think that's an extremely good thing. But I think for them, setting their criteria is going to be really important. So I think they've got to be really realistic about timescales, returns, the measurability of what they're doing, and they've got to make sure they've got the skills available to them to make sure that they, are backing things that are achievable. So there's an investment component. They'll have to, it's quite different from what they do at the moment. So, how they manage that is going to be key.
Very wise words, and a message that's very similar to the message that we convey when speaking to pension funds. John, thank you. There's been an absolutely fascinating dialogue today. You made some great points, really thought-provoking, and very much appreciate your time. So thank you for joining us.
No, it's a huge pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.